The moment someone asks you a question, they own you. And you don't even realize it's happening. Right now, someone in your life is using this trick to control you. Your boss. Your partner. That friend who always makes you feel like you're the problem. And the worst part? You keep answering. Like a puppet on a string. By the end of this video, you'll never let someone pull your strings again. This is going to be a deep dive, so get comfortable. We're going all the way down the rabbit hole. 1. The invisible cage. Let me show you something most people never notice in their entire lives. In every conversation, there are two roles being played. The judge and the defendant. The judge asks questions. The defendant answers them. And here's the dark part, the part that nobody teaches you in school, the part that will change everything once you see it. Whoever accepts the role of defendant has already lost, no matter how good their answers are. Think about the last argument you had. I guarantee it went something like this. Why didn't you text me back? Where were you last night? Why are you always so defensive? Why don't you care anymore? Why can't you just be normal? Notice the pattern? Questions. 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 And what did you do? You answered. You explained. You defended yourself. You tried to make them understand. Congratulations. You just walked into a cage and locked yourself inside. But here's what's really happening beneath the surface, beneath the words being spoken. When someone asks you a question, three things occur simultaneously in the power structure of that conversation. First, they set the frame. They decide what's important, what needs explaining, what's considered normal and what's considered suspicious. They define reality. And by answering, you accept their definition. Second, they put you in reactive mode. You're no longer driving the conversation. You're not choosing where it goes. You're responding to their agenda, playing their game by their rules on their board. Third, and this is the most insidious part, they create a debt. Every question implies that you owe them an answer. You don't. But your biology betrays you. Your amygdala lights up. Your stress response kicks in. Your voice speeds up, gets a little higher pitched. Your hands start moving more. You start talking faster, trying to convince them, trying to prove your innocence for a crime you didn't commit. All biological signs of someone who's lost control of the interaction. And they see it. They smell it. Like blood in the water. Most people go their entire lives not understanding this dynamic. They keep answering questions. They keep explaining themselves. They keep defending their choices, their actions, their very existence to people who have no right to put them on trial in the first place. And they wonder why they feel exhausted all the time. Why they feel powerless. Why they feel like they're always on the back foot, always playing defense, never quite measuring up. It's because they've accepted the role of defendant in a courtroom they never agreed to enter. Let me tell you something about power that nobody wants to admit. Power isn't about being right. It's not about being moral. It's not about being smart or capable or hardworking. Power is about who controls the frame of the conversation. That's it. That's the whole game. You can have all the facts on your side. You can have logic, reason, evidence, proof. You can be 100% right. But if you're answering their questions, defending yourself against their accusations, operating within their frame of reality, you've already lost. Because the person asking the questions is perceived as the authority, even when they don't know what they're talking about. Even when they're wrong. Even when they're the one who should be explaining themselves. Think about every power structure you've ever been part of. Teachers ask questions, students answer them. Bosses ask questions, employees answer them. Parents ask questions, children answer them. Cops ask questions, suspects answer them. Journalists ask questions, politicians answer them. Therapists ask questions, patients answer them. The person asking the questions is always in the power position. Always. Without exception. And what's crazy is that this dynamic is so invisible, so woven into the fabric of how we communicate, that most people never see it. They just feel it. They feel the shift in power. They feel themselves getting smaller, getting defensive, getting trapped. But they don't understand why. Now you do. 2. The psychology of why this works. Let's go deeper. Why does this work? Why are human beings so conditioned to answer questions, even questions that hurt us, even questions that trap us? It goes back to childhood. Way back. When you were a kid, your survival depended on answering questions from authority figures. Your parents, your teachers, other adults. When they asked you a question, you had to answer. There was no choice. Did you break this? Were you the one who made this mess? Where were you? What were you doing? Why didn't you listen? And if you didn't answer, or if you answered wrong, there were consequences. Punishment. Disapproval. Shame. Maybe even physical pain. So your brain learned a very simple equation: question from authority figure equals threat. Must answer. Must explain. Must defend. Must make them understand so they don't hurt me. This gets hardwired into your nervous system. It becomes automatic. Unconscious. And then you grow up. You become an adult. You're no longer dependent on these authority figures. You have autonomy, independence, your own life. But the wiring remains. The conditioning remains. So when someone asks you a question in that certain tone, that prosecutorial tone, that accusatory tone, your childhood brain activates. The part of you that's still 5 years old and terrified of disappointing daddy or getting in trouble with teacher comes online. And you answer. You explain. You defend. You try to make them happy, try to make them understand, try to avoid their disapproval. Even though you're an adult now. Even though they have no actual power over you. Even though you could just walk away. You can't. Because your biology has you in a chokehold. This is why people stay in toxic relationships. This is why employees tolerate abusive bosses. This is why grown adults still feel like scared children around their parents. This is why you keep explaining yourself to people who will never understand or care. It's not weakness. It's conditioning. But here's the good news: once you see the conditioning, once you understand it, you can override it. You can choose a different response. You can refuse to play the game. But first, you need to understand the game at a deeper level. You need to see how questions are weaponized against you every single day. 3. The types of attack questions. Not all questions are weapons. Some questions are genuine. Some questions come from curiosity, from care, from a real desire to understand. But some questions are attacks disguised as curiosity. And you need to learn to recognize them instantly, in real time, so you can respond appropriately instead of walking into the trap. Let me break down the main types of attack questions that people use to dominate you. The first type is the prosecutor. These are attack questions disguised as innocent inquiry. Why do you always do this? What were you thinking? Don't you think you're being unreasonable? How could you be so careless? Why can't you just be normal like everyone else? Notice something about these questions: they're not actually questions. They're accusations with a question mark stapled to the end. The person asking doesn't want information. They want you to feel bad. They want you to admit guilt. They want you to accept their narrative that you're wrong, you're broken, you're the problem. The answer doesn't matter. You could give the perfect explanation and it wouldn't change anything. Because the point isn't to understand. The point is to prosecute. Most people don't recognize this. They think if they just explain thoroughly enough, give enough context, show their reasoning, the other person will suddenly understand and the conflict will resolve. Wrong. You're being prosecuted, not questioned. And in a prosecution, the outcome is already decided. You're guilty. The trial is just theater. The second type is the trap. These questions are designed so that every possible answer makes you look guilty or wrong. Do you trust me or not? Are you saying I'm a liar? So you think you're better than everyone else? Do you love me or don't you? Are you with me or against me? These are false binary questions. They force you to choose between two options, both of which serve the asker's agenda. It's a rhetorical fork in the road where every path leads to the same destination, you looking bad. If you say yes, you're admitting to their framing. If you say no, you're confirming their suspicion. If you try to add nuance, you're being evasive. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. It's a psychological mousetrap designed to snap shut no matter which direction you move. The third type is the deflection. This is when someone who is clearly in the wrong suddenly starts asking you questions, and somehow you end up defending yourself instead of them explaining themselves. They cheated on you. But now they're asking why you went through their phone. They lied to you. But now they're asking why you don't trust them. They failed to deliver. But now they're asking why you're being so critical. This is masterful in its simplicity. They committed the offense, but through the power of questions, they've reversed the roles. Now you're the defendant. Now you're explaining your behavior. Now you're on trial for how you reacted to their betrayal. And if you're not careful, you'll spend the entire conversation justifying why you were upset instead of them explaining why they did what they did. This happens in relationships constantly. One person does something hurtful. The other person gets upset. And then the first person somehow makes the conversation about how the second person expressed their upset rather than about the hurtful action that caused it. Why are you yelling? Why are you so emotional? Why can't you just talk to me calmly? Why do you always make such a big deal out of everything? Boom. Just like that, the person who got hurt is now defending their emotional response, and the person who caused the hurt gets to play the role of the calm, reasonable one asking questions. It's conversational judo. And most people don't see it happening until they're already on the ground. Now here's what almost everyone does when they encounter these attack questions: they try to answer them correctly. They think if they just explain well enough, provide enough evidence, defend themselves thoroughly enough, the other person will finally understand and the conflict will resolve. This is the biggest mistake you can make. Because you can't win a rigged game by playing it better. The game itself is the problem. The act of answering is the trap. When you answer a prosecutor question, you validate the frame that you're on trial. When you answer a trap question, you accept the false binary. When you answer a deflection question, you accept the role reversal. The only way to win is to refuse to play. To flip the board entirely. And that's what we're going to talk about next. 4. The counter moves. So how do you escape the cage? How do you refuse the role of defendant when someone is trying to force you into it? You use the same weapon they're using against you. Questions. Let me show you the main counter moves that shift power back to you instantly. These aren't tricks or gimmicks. These are fundamental principles of conversational power that work because they operate on the same psychological level as the attacks themselves. The first counter move is the mirror. When someone asks you an attack question, you don't answer it. You reflect it back to them. They ask, "Why didn't you call me back?" You respond, "Why do you need me to call you back?" They ask, "Why are you being so defensive?" You respond, "Why do you see defense in me asking a question?" They ask, "Don't you trust me?" You respond, "Why are you asking me that right now?" See what just happened? You didn't defend. You didn't explain. You didn't accept the frame that you owe them an answer. You just mirrored their question back to them. And now they're the one who has to explain. They're the one on the spot. They're the one who has to justify why they asked the question in the first place. The judge just became the defendant. This feels uncomfortable at first. Your conditioning screams at you to answer, to explain, to smooth things over. But you have to resist that impulse. You have to sit in the discomfort and let them feel it instead. Because that discomfort, that pressure to fill the silence, to explain yourself, that's the cage. And you're handing it back to them. The second countermove is the meta-question. This is when you question the question itself. You go one level above the conversation and analyze it rather than participating in it. They ask, "Where were you last night?" You respond, "What are you really asking me right now?" They ask, "Why don't you ever listen to me?" You respond, "What's this conversation actually about?" They ask, "Do you even care anymore?" You respond, "Why are you asking me that question?" This is powerful because it forces them to be explicit about what they're really doing. Most attack questions work because they're implicit. The accusation is hidden in the question. By going meta, you're making the implicit explicit. And when someone has to explicitly state their accusation instead of hiding it in a question, something interesting happens. They either have to own it fully, which makes them vulnerable, or they have to back down and admit they were being manipulative. Either way, you're no longer in the defendant position. The third countermove is the refusal. Sometimes the most powerful move is simply refusing to accept the premise of the question at all. They ask, "Why do you always do this?" You respond, "I don't accept the word always in that question. It's not accurate and I'm not going to defend myself against an exaggeration." They ask, "Are you calling me a liar?" You respond, "That's not a question I'm going to answer because it's designed to trap me regardless of how I respond." They ask, "Why can't you just be normal?" You respond, "I'm not going to accept your definition of normal as the standard I should be measuring myself against." This is advanced. This requires a backbone. This requires you to be comfortable with someone being upset with you for not playing their game. But when you explicitly refuse to play, when you name the game they're trying to run on you, something fascinating happens. Their script breaks. They have nowhere to go. Because the entire attack was predicated on you accepting the question as legitimate. And you just didn't. The fourth countermove is the redirect. Instead of answering their question, you ask a completely different question that shifts the entire frame of the conversation. They ask, "Why didn't you finish that project?" You respond, "What's the real issue here?" "Because I don't think this is actually about the project." They ask, "Why have you been so cold lately?" You respond, "What's changed for you that you're interpreting my behavior this way?" They ask, "Why don't you appreciate what I do for you?" You respond, "What do you need from me that you're not getting?" This is powerful because you're refusing to operate in their frame entirely. You're not defending against their accusation. You're not even acknowledging it as valid. You're redirecting to what's really happening beneath the surface. And often, when you redirect like this, you expose the real issue. The question about the project wasn't about the project. It was about them feeling insecure about their own performance. The question about being cold wasn't about your behavior. It was about them feeling disconnected and not knowing how to say it directly. The question about appreciation wasn't about appreciation. It was about them feeling unvalued and trying to extract validation through guilt. By redirecting, you short-circuit the manipulation and go straight to the actual issue. Which is either going to lead to a real conversation, or it's going to expose that they weren't interested in a real conversation in the first place. Either way, you're not the defendant anymore. The fifth countermove is the silence. This is the most powerful response of all, and it's the hardest for most people to execute. They ask an attack question. You look at them. You say nothing. You hold eye contact. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. You let the silence sit there like a weight in the room. The silence creates a vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum. Humans do too. The pressure to fill the silence becomes almost unbearable. But you're not the one feeling that pressure. They are. Because they asked a question and you didn't answer it. You didn't validate the question by trying to defend against it. You just looked at them and said nothing. And in that silence, something shifts. They start to feel what you were supposed to feel. The discomfort. The uncertainty. The need to explain themselves. So they start talking. They start filling the silence. They start explaining why they asked the question. They start defending their right to ask it. They start revealing their actual motivations and insecurities. And you didn't say a single word. You just refused to play, and they played against themselves. This is the highest level of conversational power. Not engaging in the battle. Just standing still while they fight shadows. 5. The philosophy of power. Now I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds manipulative. This sounds toxic. This sounds like game playing, and I don't want to be that kind of person. And I get it. These are dark psychology tools. They are manipulative in a sense. But here's what you need to understand, these tools are already being used on you. Every single day. By people in your life who learned them instinctively, who weaponize questions without even consciously knowing they're doing it. Your passive-aggressive coworker. Your guilt-tripping parent. Your controlling partner. That friend who always makes you feel small. They're all running these patterns on you. I'm not teaching you to become an attacker. I'm teaching you to recognize when you're being attacked, and how to defend yourself without becoming defensive. There's a huge difference between using these tools offensively to dominate people, and using them defensively to refuse domination. One is predatory. The other is self-preservation. Think of it like martial arts. Martial arts teaches you how to hurt people. But that's not why most people learn it. They learn it so they don't get hurt. They learn it for confidence, for boundaries, for the ability to defend themselves if necessary. That's what this is. Conversational martial arts. But there's something deeper happening here. Something that goes beyond tactics and techniques. What you're really learning is how to stop deriving your sense of self-worth from other people's approval. How to stop seeking external validation for your existence. How to stop explaining yourself to people who will never understand or care. When you refuse to defend yourself, when you refuse to answer attack questions, when you refuse to play the defendant, you're making a profound statement about your relationship with power itself. You're saying, I don't need you to understand me. I don't need you to approve of me. I don't need to justify my existence or my choices to you. I'm not on trial. And you're not my judge. That's not arrogance. That's self-respect. Most people are desperate for understanding. They think if they just explain themselves well enough, thoroughly enough, perfectly enough, other people will finally get it. Other people will finally see their side. Other people will finally validate them. But here's the truth, people who want to understand you will understand you with minimal explanation. And people who don't want to understand you won't understand you no matter how much you explain. So stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Stop defending yourself to people who have already decided you're guilty. Stop answering questions from people who ask them as attacks rather than genuine inquiry. Your energy is finite. Your time is finite. Your emotional capacity is finite. Every time you engage in these defensive conversations, every time you try to explain yourself to someone who's already decided you're wrong, you're hemorrhaging energy. You're pouring yourself into a black hole that gives nothing back. And at the end of it, you're exhausted. Depleted. Empty. And they're exactly where they started, convinced they were right all along. What did you gain? Nothing. What did you lose? Everything. So stop playing a game you can't win. Stop accepting the role of defendant in trials you never agreed to participate in. There's a quote often attributed to Machiavelli, though I'm not sure it's actually from him: "It is much safer to be feared than loved." In modern terms, in the context of social dynamics rather than political power, I would translate that as, it is much safer to be respected than understood. Because respect doesn't require explanation. Respect doesn't require defense. Respect comes from boundaries, from knowing your worth, from refusing to diminish yourself to make others comfortable. When you stop defending yourself, when you stop explaining yourself, when you stop seeking understanding from people who aren't capable of giving it, something amazing happens. Some people get confused. They don't know how to deal with you anymore because you stopped playing the game they're used to playing. Some people get angry. They escalate. They push harder. They ask more aggressive questions. They're trying to pull you back into the defendant role because that's where they're comfortable. But some people, the ones worth keeping around, actually respect you more. Because you finally stopped dancing to their tune. You finally established a boundary. You finally said, through your actions if not your words, that you are not available to be interrogated or diminished. And that is attractive. That is magnetic. That is power. 6. Real-world applications. Let's get practical now. Let's look at how this actually plays out in real situations, in the real world, with real people and real consequences. Job interviews. This is one of the most common places where people accept the defendant role without even realizing it. Standard approach goes like this. Interviewer asks a question designed to expose your weakness. Tell me about a time you failed. Why did you leave your last job after only 6 months? I see you have a gap in your resume, can you explain that? Why should we hire you? And most people immediately go into defense mode. They try to explain away the perceived weakness. They try to reframe it as actually a strength. They try to convince the interviewer that the red flag isn't really a red flag. They're playing defendant. And in that role, even if they give great answers, they've already positioned themselves as less valuable, as someone who has something to prove. Power approach looks completely different. The interviewer asks about the 6-month job tenure. Instead of immediately defending it, you ask a question. What concerns you about short tenures? Or, what are you really trying to assess with that question? The frame shifts immediately. You're not defending. You're having a conversation between equals. You're treating the interview as a mutual evaluation rather than an interrogation. Some interviewers won't like this. They're used to being the sole authority in the room. But the companies and managers worth working for will respect it. Because it shows confidence. It shows that you know your value and you're not desperate. Relationships are another major arena. This is where attack questions do the most emotional damage because they're wrapped in intimacy and supposed love. Your partner asks, "Why don't you ever listen to me?" Standard defensive response, "I do listen. Just yesterday I listened when you talked about work for an hour. I always listen to you." You're defending. You're proving. You're trying to convince them that their perception is wrong. And it never works. Because the question wasn't really about listening. It was about them feeling unheard, and your defensive response just made them feel more unheard. Power approach, they ask why you never listen. You pause. You make eye contact. And you ask, "What do you need from me right now?" You didn't accept the accusation. You didn't defend against the word never. You didn't try to prove them wrong. You redirected to the actual need beneath the attack. That's maturity and strategy combined. That's how you have a real conversation instead of a power struggle. Workplace politics is the third major arena. This is where questions are used as weapons constantly, often by people who've learned to do it instinctively to climb the corporate ladder. A colleague asks in a meeting, "Why wasn't I included in that email chain?" The question seems innocent. But it's not. It's an implicit accusation. It's them positioning themselves as wronged, and you as the person who wronged them, in front of other people. Standard response: "Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were on there, or I didn't think you needed to be looped in on that particular thread, or it was just about this one specific thing." You're defending. You're apologizing. You're accepting blame for something that might not even require an apology. And everyone in the meeting just watched you accept the subordinate position. Power response: should you have been? What's your stake in this? Direct. Clear. Refusing the implicit shame. Putting the question back on them to justify why they should have been included rather than you having to justify why they weren't. This is not about being an asshole. This is about refusing to accept unearned guilt and implicit accusations. This is about maintaining your power position in professional environments where people constantly try to diminish you to elevate themselves. Family dynamics is perhaps the most challenging arena because these patterns are often decades old. Your mother asks, "Why don't you ever call me?" Your father asks, "When are you going to get a real job?" Your siblings ask, "Why do you always have to be so difficult?" These questions carry the weight of years. They carry your entire childhood conditioning. They hit all your buttons because these people installed the buttons. Standard response is pure defense: "I do call you mom. I called you last week." Or, "This is a real job, Dad, it just doesn't look like what you think a job should look like." Or, "I'm not being difficult, you're being unreasonable." You're back in childhood. You're the kid trying to avoid punishment, trying to win approval, trying to prove you're good enough. Power response requires you to break generational patterns. "Mom, what's this really about?" Or, "Dad, I'm not going to defend my career choices to you." Or, "I'm not going to accept the premise that I'm the difficult one in this family. This is hard. This will create conflict. Your family might not like it. They might push back hard because you're changing the rules of a game they've been playing with you for decades. But here's the thing, that game was destroying you. That game kept you small and seeking their approval forever. That game made you feel like a perpetual child no matter how old you got. Breaking it might hurt in the short term. But in the long term, it's the only path to actual adult relationships with your family members, if those are even possible. 7. The deeper game. Let me tell you what's really happening when you master the psychology of questions. You're not just learning conversation tactics. You're not just learning how to win arguments or avoid manipulation. You're learning something fundamental about power itself. Power is perception. That's all it is. It's not money, though money can create the perception of power. It's not physical strength, though strength can create the perception of power. It's not intelligence, though intelligence can create the perception of power. Power is ultimately about who controls the frame of reality in any given interaction. And questions are the invisible architecture of frames. Think about every authority structure that exists. Religion. The priest asks questions in catechism. The follower answers. Education. The teacher asks questions. The student answers. Law. The judge asks questions. The witness answers. Medicine. The doctor asks questions. The patient answers. Therapy. The therapist asks questions. The client answers. Questions establish hierarchy. Questions determine who's evaluating and who's being evaluated. Questions decide who's in the power position and who's subordinate. This has been understood by every power structure in human history. Socrates knew it 2,400 years ago. He became the most influential philosopher in Western civilization not by making claims, but by asking questions. The Socratic method isn't about answering, it's about questioning. He would question his opponent's positions until they contradicted themselves, until they defeated their own arguments, until they had no ground left to stand on. And he never had to claim he was right. He just asked questions. And let people destroy themselves trying to answer them. The Inquisition knew it. They tortured people not primarily for information, but to force them into the defendant role, to make them confess, to make them answer questions until they broke. Every authoritarian regime knows it. The interrogation. The show trial. The demand that you explain yourself, justify yourself, defend yourself against accusations that have no basis in reality. The process is the punishment. The act of being questioned, of being put on trial, of being forced into the defendant role, that's the mechanism of control. Good parents intuitively understand the inverse. They ask their children questions not to interrogate them, but to help them think. What do you think you should do? How do you feel about this? What would happen if you chose that? These questions empower rather than diminish because they're not attacks, they're invitations to autonomy. Good leaders ask questions to empower their teams. What's your take on this? What do you think we should do? What resources do you need? These questions create buy-in and ownership rather than compliance. The difference between empowering questions and attack questions is intent. Empowering questions genuinely seek understanding or genuinely offer autonomy. Attack questions seek to diminish, control, or trap. And you can feel the difference. Your body knows the difference even when your mind tries to rationalize it. When someone asks you a genuine question, you feel curiosity from them. You feel openness. You feel space to think and respond authentically. When someone asks you an attack question, you feel judgment. You feel pressure. You feel the trap closing. Your nervous system activates. Your body knows you're under threat even if it's just a conversational threat. Trust that feeling. Your body is smarter than your rationalizations. When you feel that trap sensation, that's when you deploy these counter moves. That's when you refuse to play defendant. That's when you mirror, go meta, refuse, redirect, or go silent. Not as manipulation. As self-defense. 8. The ultimate defense. Here's what all of this is really building toward. The ultimate defense isn't a technique. It's not a clever response or a strategic silence. The ultimate defense is self-knowledge. Self-acceptance. Integration of your shadow. When you truly know yourself, when you've faced your flaws and failures and integrated them, when you've accepted your shadow and made peace with your imperfections, you become psychologically untouchable. Not because you're perfect, but because you're no longer defending against your own truth. Think about it. Why do attack questions work in the first place? Because they hit on something you're already insecure about. They expose something you're already trying to hide. They accuse you of something you secretly fear might be true. If someone accuses you of being lazy and you know you're not lazy, genuinely know it in your bones, their accusation has no power. It just bounces off. You might be confused why they said it, but you're not hurt by it. You're not defensive about it. But if someone accuses you of being lazy and there's a part of you that fears you might be lazy, that you're not doing enough, that you're falling behind, that accusation lands like a knife. And you immediately defend. Because you're not just defending against their accusation, you're defending against your own fear that they might be right. This is why the same accusation can devastate one person and have zero effect on another. It's not about the accusation itself. It's about what that accusation touches inside you. So the real work isn't learning clever responses to attack questions. That's useful, that's tactical, but it's surface level. The real work is doing the internal excavation. Looking at your insecurities. Examining your fears. Facing the parts of yourself you're ashamed of, the parts you're trying to hide, the parts you hope nobody ever sees. And then accepting them. Integrating them. Owning them. Yes, I'm sometimes lazy. Yes, I'm sometimes selfish. Yes, I'm sometimes arrogant. Yes, I sometimes fail. Yes, I sometimes hurt people I care about. Yes, I have darkness in me. And I'm still worthy. I'm still valuable. I'm still deserving of respect and dignity. My imperfections don't disqualify me from humanity. When you get to that place, when you've truly owned your shadow, something remarkable happens. People can't use your flaws against you anymore. Because you're not hiding them. You're not defending them. You've already acknowledged them. There's nothing to expose. Someone says, "You're being arrogant." You say, "Yeah, sometimes I am." What's your point? The attack has nowhere to land. You agreed with it. You didn't defend. You didn't deny. You just owned it without shame. And when you do that, you've stolen their weapon. They were expecting defense, expecting denial, expecting to pin you down with the accusation. Instead, you just stood there. Unmoved. Because you're not at war with yourself anymore, so you're not threatened by them pointing out what you already know. This is the paradox of power. The less you have to defend, the more powerful you become. The more you accept about yourself, the less anyone can use against you. The more integrated you are, the less fragmented you feel when attacked. This is what Nietzsche meant when he talked about becoming who you are. Not changing into someone else. Not perfecting yourself. But fully accepting, fully integrating, fully owning who you actually are, shadows and all. That's when you become genuinely untouchable. Not because you have no flaws. But because you're no longer ashamed of them. So here's your challenge. Your experiment. Your initiation into a different way of being in the world. For the next 7 days, play the no defense game. Every time someone asks you a question that feels like an attack, every time someone tries to put you on trial, every time someone demands you explain yourself or justify your choices or defend your existence, don't do it. Use one of the 5 counter moves instead. Mirror the question back. Go meta and question the question. Refuse the premise. Redirect to what's really happening. Or just be silent. And here's the most important part, observe. Pay attention to what happens. Pay attention to how you feel. Pay attention to how other people react. Some people will get confused. They'll ask if you're okay, if something's wrong. Because you've stopped playing the game they're used to.